Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. History podcast. In the previous episode, I discussed the clash that was emerging between those in the United States, mostly the common folks who were pushing for greater democracy, greater participation in their governments, whether at the state, local, or national level, through voting rights, through the ability to be members of various representative bodies, and the pushback that they got from the more traditional elites, many of whom had come together at the Constitutional Convention to assert greater control for the more traditional ruling class, the wealthy, well-educated folks who had played a prominent role in colonial society. It was also those same people who had led the revolution in many cases. I discussed the conflict between growing democracy and those who saw it as kind of a danger. I also talked about the difficulties facing the Washington administration as it took office, whether that's Native Americans on the frontier or threats from Britain and Spain, or the fiscal difficulties that we've gone over quite a bit in the last few episodes. In this episode, I'm going to get into some of the more concrete ways in which the Washington administration and the Congress started to form what the government would actually look like. Because as I mentioned quite a bit in the last episode, the Constitution is very short, and there weren't a lot of beaten pathways for these folks to construct a republic from scratch. They had to figure out a lot of stuff on the fly. So I'm going to get into that in this episode today, but before I do, I'd like to ask y'all to please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. It helps the channel grow, certainly helps me keep doing this. So if you're enjoying what you're seeing and hearing, please like and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Spread the word if you feel like that's something you'd like to do as well. That would be awesome. I'm going to begin this episode, as I typically do, by giving you a question to think about and reminding you of the resources that I'm using for this episode to construct the episode. So let me first start off with the resources that I'm using. They haven't really changed from the last episode. There is, of course, Give Me Liberty, the very common AP US History textbook. There is The American Pageant, also a very common AP US History textbook. There is John Adams, the biography by David McCullough, which I've referenced before. There is The Art of Power, the biography of Thomas Jefferson, that I've mentioned in previous episodes as well. And then there is the latest book in the Oxford History of the United States series that I introduced in the last episode. It's called Empire of Liberty, and it's by Gordon S. Wood, and it covers the period roughly 1785 to 1815. So I'll be using it for quite a while in the next few episodes. So the question that I think it would be good for you to consider as I'm going through this information is this: what precedents did both Washington and members of Congress set for how their respective institutions would function for future presidents and representatives or senators? I'll say that one more time. What precedents did both Washington and members of Congress set for how their respective institutions would function for future presidents and representatives or senators? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right in now to the new information. I'm going to start by talking about the wake-up call that the folks who led the revolution, who had played a principal role in designing the governments both at the state and national level, received as the revolution wore on and as they tried to kind of assert the form of government that they thought would be best. Though the Constitution had been ratified, founders understood that politics had changed and was not going to go back to what they had imagined it would be. Their vision during the revolution and after the revolution was over was not going to be exercised in the way that they had imagined. There would be no class of self-sacrificing, wealthy, well-educated aristocrats that would run the country in the best interests of everyone. That is what guys like Washington and Madison and Hamilton had more or less envisioned when the country became independent, that there would be this class of elites that would run things in the best interests of all Americans and would do so dispassionately, whether what they were doing served their interests or not. Now, if that sounds a little bit fanciful to those of you listening to this, it does to me too. it's not something that I think with our modern sort of cynical way of looking at people in power, we could even take seriously for a little bit. But it's genuinely the way that guys like Washington and Hamilton and Madison thought that a republic would function. That there would be this set of elites who didn't have a whole lot to gain by what they would do in government and would kind of run things for the benefit of everyone because they were wealthy and therefore didn't have a lot to try to achieve with their roles in government, and they were well educated and they were civic minded. That's what a lot of the founders, the guys who designed the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and various state governments, it wasn't universal, but it was what a lot of them had in mind when they were putting together the government after the Revolution was over. But this is something that the Founding Fathers realized, some sooner than others, was not going to be how things were going to work. That inevitably, almost everyone would look out for their own interests. That this whole notion of there being this class of people who were above reproach and above temptation was kind of absurd and idealistic and fanciful and just not something that could ever become reality or that people would even trust to become reality. Average Americans would just not trust that any class of people would not act in their own self-interest. Washington came to this conclusion a little bit sooner than most of the rest of the guys who wanted the Constitution. Washington, wrote to John Hancock in 1776, but after the first emotions are over, to expect among such people as compose the bulk of an army that they are influenced by any other principles than those of interest is to look for what never did, and I fear never will, happen. And he's trying to say that at the end of the day, almost everyone is going to do what is in their own self-interest, that as much as I, George Washington, believe in this idea of civic mindedness, of looking out for the interest of everyone, and putting aside what I want to sacrifice my interests for the greater good, most people don't work that way. And there's a lot of evidence to show that Washington did genuinely work that way. I mean, he didn't have a lot of interest in becoming president. He really had to be talked into it. And he, from Jump Street, as I've mentioned in the episodes where I discussed the Revolution, didn't have a lot of faith in himself as a commander and constantly doubted himself and really just wished he could go back to being a planter in Virginia. That was the life that he wanted. So someone like Washington, and a few of the other founding fathers as well, did really seem to have this ideal of public service for the sake of public service and not for benefiting themselves in some way, for becoming famous, for becoming wealthy, for adding to their mystique, or whatever it is that motivates a lot of folks to go into politics now and many, many years prior. A handful of these guys really did seem to buy into that notion of, no, I'm doing this for the greater public good and because I love my country. That's why I'm being a part of the government. That's why I'm presenting myself for public office. It's why I'm being an officer in the army and so forth and so on. And those that had this vision of a government run by elites probably couldn't have achieved it even if they'd wanted to. That's the realization that a lot of them started to have as the 1780s wore on. The middle class had successfully asserted itself in spite of the Constitution, which sought to put more power in the hands of traditional elites. Self-interest came to rule the way that the government functioned at pretty much every level. Different groups and different individuals at the state level, at the local level, at the national level, advocated for themselves and pushed for what they thought was in their best interest. They tried to get the government to do what was good for them. And I'm talking about like merchants tried to get the governments at various levels to do what was good for them. Farmers tried to get the government at various levels to do what was good for them. Artisans, manufacturers, all kinds of different folks from different economic walks of life and who earned their living in different ways and had different motivations and desires for what the government would do, petition the government at the state level, at the national level, at the local level, actively. And that was the dynamic that took over. It was not this class of elites that's removed from self-interest that is kind of just acting on its own to do what it thinks is best for the country. It is all of these different groups of people and individuals who are saying, I want this, I want that, I want this, and they are actively engaged with their government trying to get what they want. And there are lots of examples that you could look at in like National Archives or whatever of people approaching their congressman, their senator, whoever it is, their governor, with written letters or in person to say, hey, could you do this for me? That notion of Americans asking for what they want from their government, that started right from the get-go. As Madison designed the Constitution, and as the Constitutional Convention carried on, and he and others around him pushed for the Constitution to be ratified, he had a very particular vision in his mind for what the national government would be. Madison hoped that the national government would be, quote, a disinterested and dispassionate umpire in disputes between different passions and interests, unquote. Of course, that's not really how it worked out. Americans petitioned the national government just like they petitioned every other level of government, and it became a contest of lobbying and advocacy, the way that it is now. So this idealism that the founders had for an elite group of people who would dispassionately govern over all of America, that faded away pretty quickly and subsided to the reality of individuals and groups very actively petitioning the government in their interests. Thomas Jefferson is one of the few guys that clung to his idealism the longest, and it was a little different. It was actually quite a bit different than this notion of elites kind of dispassionately running things. Jefferson was a believer in democracy. He never passed on a moment to talk about how much he admired regular people and their capacity to make decisions. I remember reading one quotation of his where he said he thought that like an average plowman could make a better decision, at least as good of a decision as a well-educated gentleman. Frankly, Jefferson is a little annoying to me in a lot of ways. He is kind of absurdly idealistic in his view of humanity and what he thinks about society in general and the relationship between government and society in a way that really bothers me. I'm going to get into this later on, but in the rivalry between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, I am very much Team Hamilton. His view, Hamilton's view of humanity and the way that society works is a lot closer to my own than Jefferson's is. Jefferson, he's kind of a wiener, if I'm being honest. That's sort of what I think after having read extensively about the man. Kind of a wiener. Anyway, so the first elections of 1788 sent mostly supporters of the Constitution to Congress. At least 48 of the 59 representatives and 18 of the 22 senators had wanted the Constitution ratified. So that's a very healthy majority of those in the first Congress who had supported the Constitution coming into existence and becoming the new law of the land and creating the new government. Washington was unanimously elected as president in the Electoral College, and he very obviously was somebody who wanted the Constitution put into place. He presided over the Constitutional Convention, signed it when it came time to sign it, and advocated in what limited manner he thought acceptable for the Constitution to be ratified. As I discussed in the last episode, though, the Constitution didn't provide a very detailed blueprint for how all these branches of government and these different offices were going to work. This was something that these guys had to figure out, and they were throwing shit at the wall and seeing what stuck, in many cases, for how all this was going to work. Both the House and the Senate, on the one hand, and the executive, on the other hand, had very little idea how their particular pieces of the new federal government were going to function and interact on a daily basis. That was a tricky thing too. How would we communicate with each other in the executive and the legislative branches? The first Congress was thought of almost as a kind of second constitutional convention. 20 members of that first Congress had been in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention at one time or another. Remember that a lot of members of the Constitutional Convention kind of came in and out. And Congress was almost the de facto lone element of government for quite some time. Congress, had to organize the executive and judiciary by itself. Congress had to create executive departments and it had to spell out the way that the judiciary outside of the Supreme Court would work, because apart from the Supreme Court, there isn't really anything mentioned in Article 3 of the Constitution about what the judiciary is going to look like. What gave Congress even greater responsibility than the executive in these very early days was that though Washington was inaugurated in April of 1789, most of the executive offices were not filled until late summer. And the judiciary wasn't created by the Judiciary Act of 1789 until the early fall of 1789. So Congress was kind of on its own for quite some time as the new government started to take shape. As I mentioned in the last episode, Madison was the guy who took the lead on the Bill of Rights. Makes sense, right? Since he was the dude who we call the father of the Constitution and had the most important role in designing it. He centered these amendments that he came up with, and I think there were 12 of them originally, maybe 13, I can't remember exactly, but it's one or the other, I'm pretty sure. He centered these amendments around protections for states and individuals from the power of the federal government. And that is, if you look at the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, the common thread that pretty much all of them have is that they are protecting individual rights and states' rights from this new powerful federal government that made a lot of folks really nervous. Remember that in the ratification fight, this is sort of the central principle that those opposed to the Constitution made their arguments about. That this new government was way too powerful. It would be another British government that would invalidate the will of the individuals or the will of the states and just become a behemoth that would be tyrannical. That is the way that a lot of anti-federalists looked at the new national government under the Constitution. So Madison and some others decided they wanted to make it real clear to everybody that this new government was nothing to be afraid of. If you look at the Bill of Rights, there's the First Amendment's got all those protections, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to petition the government, freedom of assembly. There's the Fourth Amendment, which protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures, something that a lot of them had thought about when Britain was in charge and was randomly searching people for smugglers. There's the Fifth Amendment, of course, which means that you don't have to incriminate yourself. And then there's the 10th Amendment, which states that all rights and powers not given to the national government are reserved to the states. So the Bill of Rights is there to reassure people worried about the new national government that they don't have to be worried, that there are these protections in place. And Madison wanted to make that distinction that these amendments existed to protect people from the federal government, the new national government, rather than shifting constitutional powers back to the states like taxation. He wanted to keep those powers that were fundamental, in his view, to a government, a nation state operating effectively with the national government. In these early days of the new government, Madison was also very important as a link between the legislative and executive branches, because Madison was a member of the new national government as a member of the House of Representatives, and he was somebody that knew Washington. He was also from Virginia. He's the guy that had encouraged Washington, kind of propagandized him into coming to the Constitutional Convention. With Madison's connection to Washington and his membership in Congress, he was able to guide the legislative process in the legislature and communicate and keep the people in the executive branch abreast of what was going on. He, in fact, Madison, wrote both of Washington's inaugural addresses. So he is, in addition to being father of the Constitution, a very important part of the early days of the new national government finding its identity. As I mentioned a moment ago, Congress wrote and passed the Judiciary Act of 1789 to construct the basic plan for everything in the judiciary, not including the Supreme Court. So all of the federal district courts, the appellate courts, the Judiciary Act of 1789 lays out the basic structure of what they are going to look like. Apart from the Judiciary Act, I mentioned that Congress had a role in creating the basic structure of the executive branch, which it did. It created 3 new executive departments in the summer of 1789, and Washington formed the first cabinet. Executive departments are things like the State Department and the, at this point, Department of War Department, or the Department of, these days, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services, what have you. It was much, much smaller back in these days. Specifically, Congress created the Treasury Department, the State Department, and the War Department. Pretty fundamental when you think about it, right? Treasury deals with the money and the finances. State is going to deal with all the foreign affairs stuff, and the War Department is national defense. We call it defense now. Eventually, there is the Attorney General's Department, the Department of Justice. There is the Postmaster General's Department, the Postal Service, which was a cabinet position for quite some time. There are some other sort of cabinet level positions that don't continue to exist because of the way that the United States grew. The Superintendent of the Land Office and the Governor of the Northwest Territory. Those, of course, have to do with the way that the land the United States got out to the Mississippi was going to be administered and eventually made into new states. Also in the early days, the Senate gave the president exclusive power to dismiss executive officials. That is in contrast to the president's ability to appoint executive officials. That is co-signed by the Senate. Even now, cabinet members have to be approved by the Senate. Something that, if you're paying attention to the new Trump administration as it comes in, is going to be a big news story for at least the next month or two. So the Senate decided that it would grant the president power to dismiss cabinet officials' executive appointments on his own, even though the Senate, it is spelled out in the Constitution, had the ability to approve or disapprove of new appointments. And this is in contrast to that. It's also in contrast to what Hamilton wrote about in Federalist number 77, where he said that he thought the Senate should be able to approve of dismissals as well. They ended up disagreeing with him on that. It was a close vote over dismissals, and Adams had to step in and break the tie the way that vice presidents do. He was the first vice president, of course. And from that point forward, it's been the case that the president has the prerogative to dismiss cabinet appointees if that's what he chooses to do, although that has become more complicated in the years since. But you see all this, the point is that these are precedents that are being set that we still follow to a large degree. They are making decisions in the Congress and in the executive branch that are going to last for hundreds of years later. So that's why this is so important, why it's such a pivotal moment in the development, the evolution of American government, of American society. There was also a debate about whether the Senate should have an advisory role in creating treaties with foreign nations. The Senate did and does still have a role in approving, ratifying treaties with foreign countries, but in terms of being formally required to get the Senate's input on treaties as they are being constructed or negotiated, that is not something that the Senate at this time, the executive branch at this time, felt was the right path. It wasn't decided early on like this. It was actually in the wake of the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. So that's in the second Washington administration. I'll get into that later, but I just thought I would mention it now since I'm talking about the role of the Senate and the role of the executive branch as they are being sorted out at this time. Washington's big priority, as he was forming the model for what future presidents would do, was to create a greater sense of national unity. He sensed, as did a lot of the other Federalists, the guys who wanted the Constitution ratified and would become members of the Federalist Party, Washington sensed that national unity was going to be tricky, that people in different states would have a hard time thinking of themselves as Americans and not as Virginians or North Carolinians or New Yorkers or what have you. So Washington tried to do things as president that he thought would help to create a greater sense of national unity. It's a big part of the reason why he sat for so many portraits. It wasn't because he was some vain peacock that wanted to constantly have images of himself put up all over the place. It's that he understood the importance of symbols, and he wanted to become a symbol that everyone could rally around because he understood his importance to a lot of Americans. I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? I mean, he's become that symbol. He's on the dollar. He's the namesake of the capital city, right? I mean, he's very much become that symbol of national unity. In addition to sitting for a lot of portraits, Washington also went around promoting roads and canals. He promoted a national university as it was coming into being, and he tried to bring more awareness of the post office and its utility to Americans all over the place. He spent a pretty good bit of time traveling around. He went on these various tours of different states trying to, again, project national unity and remind everybody that they were all in this together. Perhaps the most important person apart from James Madison and George Washington was Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. I think it's pretty indisputable that Hamilton was the most important of the cabinet ministers. As the head of Treasury, he commanded a great deal of power and sought to use all of that as much as he could to put the country on a better path forward. There was also this pretty complicated relationship between Congress and the Treasury Department, especially in the years of the Washington administrations. Washington did not want to encroach on the legislative authority of the power of the purse. It is Congress that is supposed to control revenue and funding for various aspects of the federal government. And Washington didn't want to intrude too much on that. Hamilton was only too happy to step in. And he was able to do that both because Washington stepped back, and very specifically, when Congress created the Treasury Department, it did not mention the president and required the Secretary of the Treasury to report directly to Congress, not to the president. So it was spelled out in such a way that it would be Hamilton, not Washington, who would be working with the Congress on a lot of financial matters. Hamilton was an admirer of Great Britain, and in his vision for what the United States should do financially, he modeled what he wanted to do on what Lord Walpole of Great Britain did in the UK. He's the guy, Lord Walpole, who built the fiscal military state of Britain in the early 1700s. And that is something I discussed a while back in some of the earlier episodes. And just to give a brief explanation for what the fiscal military state is, it's this notion that as the government expands and takes on a more permanent military establishment, that then creates a need for the government to have financial control, financed by permanent taxes, and it becomes this kind of dependent cycle between the government needing money to finance the military and the military being there to stand up for the authority of the government to control the purse strings. As an admirer of Great Britain and as someone who wanted to imitate what Lord Walpole had done, Hamilton saw himself more or less as the prime minister to George Washington's monarch. As the prime minister figure in this brand new government, Hamilton felt that he could intervene in multiple executive departments, not just in his own Department of the Treasury. It's a big part of why he is definitely the most important cabinet minister in Washington's government. What you would want to know about what Hamilton planned is that his program revolved around funding all the debt that the United States had taken on. Not just the national government's debt, but all of the state debts that remained. And he wanted to fund all of these debts at par, meaning he did not want to negotiate a reduction in the amount of money that the national government or the states owed. It was important in his view because establishing the United States credit and its reliability as a borrower was going to be vital to the future economic success and financial success of the United States. If the United States was going to become a big commercial power and have a role in world trade as prominent as Britain's one day, it would have to demonstrate to other world governments and to merchants and businessmen and bankers that it was a good bet to lend money to the United States, that the United States would pay back that money. And to this day, I think the United States is one of only a couple, maybe like 2 or 3 governments in the world that have never defaulted on any loans, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. It's the reason that U.S. Treasury bills are considered more secure than gold. Hamilton's plan to pay off the debt at par involved collecting revenue from a combination of excise taxes, tariffs, and miscellaneous other revenues. But the excise taxes and the tariffs were the main 2 things. And he wanted to use the debt that was going to be doled out by this program he was instituting as money. And what I mean by that is that you could use the debt that was purchased to pay back any taxes that you might owe. And the national government vowed under Hamilton's Treasury Department that it would always accept those notes. So they were the same as money in a lot of ways, and they would hold their value relative to specie, gold or silver. But the debt wasn't just important as a form of money, which was very important because hard money, specie, gold or silver, coins or bars or whatever, was really hard to come by in the United States. So it was important, the debt, as paper money, but it was also really important as an adhesive politically for the whole country. Hamilton, and others around him thought that having this debt and having everybody invested in paying it off would make more people buy in to the success of the new government. Like if the new national government took on Rhode Island's debt, or if the new national government took on South Carolina's debt, those people in Rhode Island and South Carolina and any other state whose debt the national government wanted to pay off would be more inclined to want the national government to succeed, because they're like, oh, well, if this whole national government works out, then we don't have to pay that money that we owed. Cool. And he was right about that, as it turned out. A lot more people did root for the success of the national government because it meant that they would not have to pay off these onerous debts that they had incurred during the Revolution. Additionally, Hamilton wanted to create a Bank of the United States, which would be this independent corporation that would hold a lot of government debt, but would be mostly invested in by private investors. It was something like 25% of the bank's capitalization would be provided by the national government, and 75% would be provided by private investors. Hamilton did, to capitalize the Bank of the U.S. at something like $10 million, I think, initially. Hamilton thought that this Bank of the United States was really important for managing the country's finances, for collecting revenue, and for managing the currency as it became more common. There were those who were really opposed to the Bank of the United States, to Hamilton's whole plan, and certainly to the notion that the national government, with everybody from all over the country contributing tax revenue, would pay off the debt of states that had not yet paid off their own debt, especially when states like Virginia had paid off their own debt. There was a lot of animosity about, hey, we Virginians managed to pay off our national debt. Why should we have to pay taxes to a national government that is going to pay off the debt of these other states who didn't take care of their business? It was a real bone of contention between Hamilton and the people behind him and Jefferson and the people behind him. This is sort of the beginning of their great rivalry. How this got worked out was that Jefferson arranged a dinner in 1790, June of 1790, during which Madison and Hamilton agreed to a deal whereby Southerners who were more opposed to this notion of the national debt incorporating all of these state debts within it would agree to the assumption of this debt. So Southerners would agree to the assumption of the state debts in exchange for there being a permanent capital in the South. And that is why we have the capital in Washington, D.C., in between Virginia and Maryland on the Potomac. So apart from convincing Jefferson of the wisdom of his plan, and apart from getting Southerners on board who were not thrilled with the idea of paying off the state debts, Hamilton submitted 4 reports to Congress, which had dismissed its Ways and Means Committee, by the way, which is the Ways and Means Committee is the committee that deals with financial matters of the legislative branch for the most part. In 1790-91, Hamilton submitted these 4 reports that covered credit, a national bank, a mint that would print money, and manufacturing, which was something he was interested in providing government support for. Hamilton had an eye toward manufacturing and its importance to the future U.S. economy and its military capacity as well. But ultimately, he didn't place as much emphasis on manufacturing as I've heard some people try to credit to Hamilton. He was not somebody that was the first industrialist, in a way, which is sometimes a label that is attributed to Hamilton. But he was somebody that saw the future of the United States as commerce, perhaps in manufacturing, perhaps in trade, perhaps in agriculture, but definitely not just an agrarian nation, a nation of small farmers, the way that Jefferson envisioned the future of the United States. Hamilton and other Federalists did have the foresight, though, to see that if the United States became just an agrarian nation, the way that Jefferson had envisioned, it would be a stagnant country whose economy would be at the mercy of these great mercantilist powers in Europe, like Britain, like France, and so forth, that may or may not be willing to import American agricultural goods into their country. If the United States wanted to develop into a more sophisticated economy, it would have to develop a domestic market for those agricultural goods, and that would mean building up manufacturing, building up finance, and diversifying the economy in such a way that there could be the exchange of goods between different parts of the country. And the country wouldn't just rely on exporting agricultural goods to Europe or to other parts of the world. So Hamilton's economic program was meant to push the United States in the direction of becoming a more economically developed and diversified country like Great Britain. Great Britain, as I've already said, is a place that he admired, and he wanted the United States to be more like Great Britain than any other country that he could imagine. Of course, Hamilton had to persuade a lot of people that his plan was the right plan. There were skeptics, including George Washington. And Washington, was on the fence about whether or not to sign the Bank of the United States into being, whether to provide his signature that would make the bill that had been passed in Congress become law. Washington even went so far as to have Madison prepare a veto message for his veto of the Bank of the United States. But ultimately, Hamilton successfully refuted the arguments made by Thomas Jefferson against the Bank of the United States and by Edmund Randolph as well, who was Attorney General. Washington signed the bill that created the Bank of the United States into law on February 25th of 1791. And a big part of the reason the Bank of the United States is so important, apart from it being central to Hamilton's financial plan, is that the Bank of the United States illustrates this fundamental argument between Hamilton and the people like him who believed in the expansive powers of the national government in what you would call a loose constructionist interpretation of the Constitution, and people like Jefferson and eventually Madison, who were more nervous about an expansive national government and who believed in what they called a strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution. And basically what that means is that Hamilton believed that the national government could do things that were not explicitly stated in the Constitution. He believed that because he thought that the government would have to be more energetic and do more things, and his legal justification for this loose constructionist view is that in the instance of the Bank of the United States, the Constitution does say that the national government has control over interstate commerce. This bank is dealing with interstate commerce. The Constitution also says that the government may do what is, quote, necessary and proper in order to carry out its explicitly stated powers. This is the difference between explicitly stated powers and implied powers. The implied powers thing is how the national government has gotten to be so much bigger than the Constitution would ever suggest to you that it could be. Because things like the Bank of the United States, which are not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, can be justified into existence by, hey, Congress, the national government, has the commerce power, the power to determine things that have to do with interstate commerce, and it also has in the Constitution this necessary and proper clause. So I, Hamilton, think it is necessary and proper in order for Congress, the United States government, to execute its commerce power to have a Bank of the United States. And it's for this reason that the necessary and proper clause has been referred to as the elastic clause, because it has been used to stretch out the Constitution and create a much more powerful federal government. And this is one of the first, I think the first major instance of that. Something that is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution comes into being. So this becomes kind of the staging ground for what will be the big political divide in the country toward the end of the Washington administration, and very definitely during John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and to a lesser extent, James Madison's presidencies, between the people who want a loose constructionist interpretation of the Constitution, a more energetic federal government, a larger, more powerful federal government, and the people who want a strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution, one that limits to a much greater degree the power of the federal government. Madison and Jefferson, apart from agreeing on this strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution, also struck up a friendship in earlier years over their shared belief in religious liberty and their suspicion of government relative to society. They both were a little nervous about government power and believed more in people to interact faithfully and decently with one another. Madison and Jefferson only became closer friends and political allies during the course of the Washington administration, as Jefferson was the first Secretary of State, and Madison, as I've already discussed, played a big role in both Congress and in the executive branch. So this is all the stuff that you're seeing in the federal government. You're seeing the executive branch take shape, you're seeing the legislative branch take shape, you're seeing the judiciary take shape, and you're starting to see differing political philosophies emerge that will eventually result in the first political parties. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate your time as always. Again, please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. You can reach out to me if you'd like at howthehelldowegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can send me a text message or voicemail at 951-525-5536 with any suggestions or comments. Thanks again. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will catch you next time. Take care.